Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It gives you the tools and inspiration to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. This is where we explore how to cultivate remarkable cultures that scale and evolve as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
What I propose to the companies I work with is to look at hybrid work friction in relation to the things we took for granted in the office. So, for example, process definition. If you don't have processes defined, people can't work effectively. There is no consistency. You can't learn. So if you really look at process definition, if we look at documentation, if we look at the way we communicate, if we look at our social connection and our community, and we look at our well-being, I actually call this the hybrid work domino effect, because ultimately, if undefined business processes means that your documentation is not in order, disorganized documentation hampers effective communication. When employees can't communicate effectively with each other, it has this negative effect on their social connection. And then if they're not socially connected, it impacts their well-being.
Hey friends, welcome to episode 113 of the Culture Lab podcast. This episode is brought to you by CultureBrained, a one-of-a-kind accelerator program where culture leaders get hands-on support and guidance on how to reach their goals faster, especially now in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. CultureBrained connects you with outstanding peers on the same journey, but also with world-class experts, including people you know from the show. And they all help you identify and implement new, better ways of creating a culture where people do their best work. Check it out at tinyurl.com/culturebrained. And no need to write it down. There's a link in the show notes. Over the past few years, we've witnessed a dramatic shift in how we work. The pandemic forced many organizations to adopt remote work, and now we're blending. We're blending remote and in-office work, and we call it hybrid. And I have to be honest, I've seen many organizations that adopted this model, but very, very few that got it right. And most people that I ask about their experience with hybrid, they actually tell me that they find it surprisingly hard. It can be frustrating. And I think that my guest today, Bret Putter, identified where this frustration comes from. He calls it the hybrid friction. Bret is a leading expert in hybrid work strategies and practices. He's been helping organizations navigate the complexities of hybrid work and unlock its full potential for quite a while now. And today, he and I talk not only about the annoying hybrid friction, but also how to avoid other challenges related to hybrid work. And most importantly, we talk about strategies that you can implement to make hybrid work for you. Here is a little bit more about Bret in his own words, and I hope that you enjoy this conversation.
My name is Bret Putter. I'm the founder and CEO of CultureGene. CultureGene is a hybrid work culture consultancy, and we help companies develop high-performance hybrid cultures. I'm an author. I've written 2 books on company culture, and we've just launched the hybrid management training program to help managers optimize hybrid work. And I'm super excited to join Aga for a second time on her amazing podcast.
Yeah, welcome back.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, things have changed since the last time we spoke, right? But before we dive into the topic of change in the workplace, for the sake of the listeners who haven't heard our first interview, please tell me, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person?
Before I founded CultureGene, I was an executive search consultant. I was the MD of an executive search firm in London. And I realized over the 15 years that I ran the search firm that the searches that ran best were run by companies that had a better understanding of their culture. You could just tell the smoothness of the operation, the interactions with the candidates, the interactions with the client. And then during the interview process and then after the interview process, you could really just feel a better environment. That's what got me initially. That's what triggered me. I then started devouring books on company culture, Edgar Schein and others. And that's where it really started for me, was realizing that I could see the positive impact of a strong culture.
That's such a great perspective, and hiring is so incredibly important when it comes to cultivating a great culture. So I totally get it. It makes a lot of sense to me to have that insight at that moment. Like, yeah, really, a healthy culture, a strong culture is so incredibly important. Yeah, I can totally see how you ended up on this path that you are at the moment. So, Bret, when we first spoke, no one has heard about COVID. And this is one of the things that happened in the meantime, right? The pandemic. And as we all know, it forced a lot of organizations to adopt remote work. And basically now we find ourselves, I think, in this critical juncture where we are navigating the complexities of blending remote and in-office work into what we refer to as hybrid. And I know that you've been actively helping a lot of companies to establish high-performance, hybrid, and digital-first cultures, which means I'm assuming that you've had a first-hand view of, the typical challenges, I suppose, that arise in hybrid work setups. Could you tell us what are the most common challenges in the setup?
The biggest challenge is the remote element of hybrid work. And that challenge is experienced by most people in companies before COVID, not having any real knowledge or understanding of what a remote work environment is like or what remote work best practices are like. And I think you mentioned it earlier, this idea of blending these two things is one of the main challenges there. I also think that we have underestimated what we've lost and what we took for granted when we were in the office. I call these functional advantages of the office, where we didn't have to think about processes too much or documentation too much. We did, but it didn't become a major issue simply because the office did a lot of the work for us, those four walls. And now we're experiencing the four walls in an ad hoc or once a week or twice a week way, and it's not the same. Leaders don't seem to realize that they have to adapt and make up for what they've lost by now moving into a more hybrid environment where you have people working remote some or all of the time. Leaders are not thinking about how to adapt or make up for what they've lost, the functional advantages they've lost from the office environment.
Yeah, this is so incredibly true. I find this too. I think there are a lot of conversations about the fact that things are not the same and that we are missing something from the old way we did things and spending time in the office together. But I think we struggle to put our finger on what those things that we are missing really are. And as you say, how we will need to adopt so that we make up for them. What are the things that we need to be thinking about that we have lost through this process of moving towards remote or hybrid work setups that we're often not very cognizant about?
I've called it the 7 functional advantages of an office-based culture. I'm sure there are more, but I got lazy probably and stopped at 7. But essentially, when physical proximity and osmosis gave us a relative ease of collaboration. It wasn't perfect, but it was easy to collaborate. We didn't have to worry about process definition and documentation. We didn't even think about synchronous communication, never mind asynchronous communication. Social connection and social capital happened naturally. The relationships and trust were easy to build. We could see how happy our people were and their well-being just by being in the room. And we didn't have this new challenge that I've termed hybrid work friction. Ultimately, these 7 functional advantages together with the four walls, made up a significant part of our culture. And the office became this constant factor for our culture. We had an office-based culture because of the office. Now the office is no longer the constant factor. We've actually lost this incredibly important part of our organizational culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do we make up for it?
I think the first thing we need to think about is this idea of hybrid work friction. Hybrid work friction is the gap between optimal work in ideal working conditions in the office and the actual performance of a hybrid team. And hybrid work friction creates these barriers to effective collaboration, communication, and productivity. If you think about it, just for communication, just this idea of communication, which is the lifeblood of our organizations, hybrid work friction happens when our people are constantly interrupted and can't focus on their tasks. It happens when they're pressured to always be available. It happens when they have to wait for a meeting with somebody to get information, or they can't access a document, or they don't know where the process lives. It happens when there are too many meetings in a day, and the result of that is they have to work after hours to catch up with those meetings. And this is happening across the board in organizations tens, hundreds, thousands of times. So the first thing we need to do is we need to understand, I believe, how hybrid work friction is impacting us in our day-to-day.
And what are the factors, I suppose, that affect us most? Because I can only imagine that it's going to differ, right, from organization to organization. So do you have any tried and tested methods of almost taking stock of what is our hybrid work friction? Because I suppose this is probably the first step towards eliminating these obstacles, right?
What I propose to the companies I work with is to look at hybrid work friction in relation to the things we took for granted in the office. So, for example, process definition. If you don't have processes defined, people can't work effectively. There is no consistency. You can't learn. So if we look at process definition, if we look at documentation, if we look at the way we communicate, if we look at our social connection and our community, and we look at our well-being, I actually call this the hybrid work domino effect, because ultimately, if undefined business processes means that your documentation is not in order, disorganized documentation hampers effective communication. When employees can't communicate effectively with each other, it has this negative effect on their social connection. And then if they're not socially connected, it impacts their well-being.
That's interesting, right? Because what you're saying is that social connections in the workplace can actually be affected by something that seems so disconnected from human connections as a process. But I actually totally see that because, of course, when you don't know exactly what the process is, when it's not mapped and you don't have visibility into it, then you don't even know what you don't know. And so communication totally breaks down.
Yeah, you're spot on. It's this domino effect of, almost doesn't make sense until you think about it. But without processes, then your documentation is impacted, your communication is impacted, because we should be using more asynchronous communication and more documentation to be effective. And if we're not doing that, it'll impact us socially. We just won't communicate effectively, impact us socially and the well-being. So that for me is really where there are these layers of what we lost, what is hybrid work friction, and then how does hybrid work friction come to fruition in the organization? How does that impact us negatively? For example, the domino effect.
Yes. And it's almost like I understand, using this analogy, this metaphor of the domino, you need to play a little bit of a detective role in identifying which is the first domino probably that falls and causes this effect in your organization. Because I'm sure that depending on your situation, there are going to be certain factors that cause the most friction. And so I wonder, how do you get to the bottom of it? Like, how do you identify what is the biggest problem, the one with huge leverage, the one that if you solve it, it will stop the domino effect, basically, and you will prevent a number of other problems from occurring?
Unfortunately, from what I've seen, there's no one answer because certain departments are better at certain elements than others. So if you go to the technology department, their processes and documentation are pretty good because that's the way they're used to working. If you go to the marketing department, maybe not so good. It's ultimately on a team basis. And I think this is the other element that a lot of leaders have missed when it comes to hybrid. I mean, managers could get away with not being great managers when they're in the office. You could have this one size fits all approach and you could get away with one size fits all. You didn't have to worry about people management that much because everybody was in the office and there weren't these different personas. Now we've got personas to worry about. The person who's in the office every day, the person who doesn't want to be in the office, the person who has to take 2 hours to get into the office, the person who wants to drop off their kids or is looking after a dog that they got during COVID.
The person who works in a different time zone, right, from the rest of your team. Yeah,
exactly. There are these new dynamics, and managers' roles have become more complex as they've had to take on more responsibility. But they were never trained to actually execute on hybrid work.
Yeah, so true. And generally speaking, I think historically, leaders and managers always lacked, I feel, preparation for their role. But particularly now, because the role of managers is so incredibly more complex than it used to be, it strikes me as something incredibly important for organizations to really invest in helping their managers to get the grasp of what's required in this new reality. So do you know of any good approaches that can help managers to be on top of what they need to be doing right now in the hybrid environment?
I think the most important thing, the first step is for leaders and managers to become more remote informed. So I call this the remote informed manager or the remote informed leader. In other words, understand what the remote work best practices are. How do remote work companies do this? Because ultimately we are now spending 30, 40, 50, 60, 80, 100% of our time remote working. We're not delivering on best practices around that.
So just to clarify and understand, Bret, what you're saying is that we should be optimizing for remote in the hybrid model, not for in office, but we should be optimizing for remote.
Correct. We fundamentally know how to do in office, although in office has changed. So actually we have had to adapt, but that's not that difficult to manage an in-office environment. It's a lot more complex to manage and to work in a remote environment. So to give you just some examples, Hotjar's a fully remote environment. They have a weekly structure. So Mondays is for X, Tuesdays is for Wednesdays is no meeting day, Thursdays is this day, Friday. And so they add structure to their days to make it easier for their teams to work. And I think that's what we need to do is optimize for remote and work out what the remote work best practices are. And then where relevant, integrate these remote work best practices.
Yeah, it's almost like creating this virtual architecture that replaces the physical architecture and the space where people used to come together and work together. So you create these virtual structures, spaces, ways of working that bring some commonality to the team, right? And give people an opportunity to align and collaborate, even if it's asynchronous.
Yeah, that commonality point is super spot on because we've lost the commonality of the office. We now need to build something, another layer to build our hybrid culture upon. If we don't build that layer, then we're going to rely on the office, which means we're missing out on half, if not more, of where the culture actually happens in the organization. This is ultimately what I've built into the hybrid management training program, a process whereby you go through an understanding of what the fundamentals of hybrid work are, what the best practices of hybrid work are, and then how to integrate them into the way you work.
So if you were to give us a crash course now and share some of the elements of this program with our listeners, what do we need to know? What are the first things that we need to know?
The first thing, which we discussed earlier, is that the fundamentals of hybrid work are based around how managers' lives and responsibilities have changed and become more complex in work lives, what it means to be a remote informed manager, and then the functional advantages that we've lost, those 7 functional advantages. And then the course goes into people management. So, for example, there are 5 lessons based around outcomes-based leadership. Remote work companies all focus on outcomes-based leadership. Transparency. Remote work companies all default to transparency. One-to-one meetings and feedback. Remote work companies integrate this. They do it weekly. They don't do it monthly because they have to make up for the lost elements of what we don't have, no longer have in the office. And then the third element is around collaboration. So how to think about process definition, documentation, synchronous and asynchronous communication, social capital, social connection, and well-being. The flow of the course takes you through a journey to where you understand what needs to be integrated from a remote work perspective and then how to do that.
Let's unpack some of these elements. What is outcomes-based leadership or outcomes-based culture?
So outcomes-based leadership is focusing on the outcome. A lot of leaders are used to input-based leadership. So what did you do today? What did you do today? And that then in turn lends itself towards micromanagement. But actually, outcomes-based leadership is we have agreed on the outcome we want. This is the target. These are the tasks you have to complete for us to get there. And I will check in from time to time based on your abilities, based on your knowledge of what needs to be done. I will build training capabilities for you or mentoring capabilities for you if you need them. Ultimately, I expect you to know we've agreed on the outcome. I expect you to deliver on the outcome. You will talk to me if you're not on track.
So that's clear. And that's definitely a slightly, if not hugely different approach to what we used to do when people spent time together in the office. I think presentees, and I think it's also one of the reasons, frankly, why so many leaders want people to come back to the office. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
That the shift towards outcomes-based leadership is quite challenging for a lot of leaders. And so they'd rather have people come back into the office and be able to see them in person every day than allow for that or make that shift to that different type of leadership.
You're exactly right. It's one of the big drivers of come back in so that I can see that you're working.
Yeah. Okay. So outcomes-based leadership was the first element. Let's talk about the second one.
So transparency, this is something that every single remote work company I've worked with or studied defaults towards, and some more so than others. So for example, if you go to Buffer and you look at their website, you can see the salaries of all the CEO and all the employees. And the thing about transparency is if I am transparent, I have nothing to hide. And if I have nothing to hide, you can trust me. And trust is ultimately what drives the success of your team in a hybrid or a remote work environment. The trust starts to be stretched when we don't see one another that often, when we don't communicate in the same way we did. Strengthening that trust and building the psychological safety around that is what remote work companies are incredibly, incredibly good at. Another one to look at is GitLab, who literally put everything out on the web, and you can go look at how their company works, KPIs, targets, the works. They've got an immense amount of transparency that is a superpower for the organization.
Yeah, we're going to put a link in the show notes for our listeners to check it out because it really is impressive. I was stunned to see what they're putting out there for the world to see, because it's not just accessible to GitHub's employees, but to anyone who wants to have a look, which I think goes back to that point of accessibility of information, right? It's so incredibly important because if you don't make those things transparent and available, then you will face these situations and create friction where people don't know how to do things, cannot find relevant information. So what you're saying is transparency. Of course, number one, it's a way to build trust. But what I'm also hearing is that it is a way of enabling your employees to have access to the information that they need to do their job well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. When I talk to companies, one of the questions I ask is, what percentage of your processes are defined? What percentage of those are up to date? And what percentage of those are available for anybody to find right now? Because if I need to find out any information, if you look at the GitLab documentation, it's there. There's no friction in that system at all for anybody.
And it's a really major mindset shift, I suppose, because I know a lot of companies that are still feeling hesitant to share some information with their employees because of confidentiality reasons, fear of competitors stealing their know-how, etc., etc. So what are you seeing in that realm? Because I suppose some things perhaps need to be confidential or not. What's your view on that?
Yeah, there definitely are. There are. So GitLab have their handbook is 2,000 pages if you printed it out and over 3 million words. But that's the external one. They do have an internal handbook as well. So the internal handbook is for confidential or competitive information that is critical. With transparency, you need to find a balance. When it's personal, when it's regulatory or law based, then there's no discussion about that. But with the company, many remote work companies have had a situation where information was possibly leaked or made available. And the CEOs that have stepped up have said, okay, we don't want that to happen again, but we're not going to punish everybody for it. We're just going to try and build a better system. If you are unhappy with us, come and talk to us, which I really admire.
I really admire that too, because what I've seen happen in a lot of organizations is one employee or a couple of employees crossing the line, whatever the line is. And then suddenly you have a new regulation or a new rule that is supposed to apply to everyone. But in fact, you are punishing the majority for the mistakes of a minority, which is definitely not the way to go. So thanks for sharing that. So we talked about transparency, the second element, and then you've mentioned the third one is collaboration. So what do we need to know about that in the hybrid environment?
In collaboration, there are 5 best practices that I recognize in the remote companies I worked with and studied. And it starts with ultimately the ability to get everybody to be able to work effectively. What do we need to do? If you look at something as, in some cases, challenging as asynchronous, you've got Buffer have 17 rules for Slack, whereas Basecamp don't allow anybody to use Slack. They can't stand Slack, and there's everything in between. When it comes to these 5 best practices, communication is ultimately about building the ability for your team to collaborate and communicate effectively when they're synchronized or need to be synchronized, but also when they're async. And this is the advantage of remote work, is the flexibility. And the advantage of remote work is I can turn everything off. I won't be disturbed, and I can work for an hour flat out nonstop. And then I respond. These 5 domino effects of process definition, documentation, communication, social capital, and well-being are all part of collaborating and collaborating effectively. I'm seeing social capital really dissipate in organizations. I'm seeing social capital weaken tremendously now because people have tried the virtual drinks things and the virtual pizzas and the virtual this and the virtual that. It hasn't worked and it hasn't stuck. This element, I think, understanding that social capital is the collective value of all the connections and relationships that your teams and organization has, and you need to work on it. It's kind of the description I like about social capital is this, it's the benefits people get because of who they know. And if you don't encourage those connections, then your social capital decreases. And this is what's happening right now.
Yeah, so true, because of course, so many opportunities to build these connections have disappeared. And so an obvious question, I suppose, is How do you replace those opportunities that were lost with new ones that enable you to build equally strong social capital that obviously you need in order to be effective in your job?
Yeah, I believe this should be done at the team level. And we've developed a tool called the Social Capital Index. And the Social Capital Index basically is just a method for looking at your team and going, who do you know? Who are you collaborating with? Who are you talking to a lot, internally and externally? And then who should we know? Who should we be collaborating more with? Which departments? And then depending on the individuals in the team, you can then make it the responsibility of Jack in customer success in your team to go and connect with Mary in product, and you can do the introduction. It's kind of like that donut effect, but a little bit more deliberate and a little bit more intentional about building your team's social capital rather than broad social capital, because it ultimately will happen anyway.
And what about those serendipitous connections and the things and the connections that you don't know that you don't know, but you should know, people that you didn't know that you should know, but then, in the office, you would just bump into them and say hello at the coffee machine and suddenly realize that you should talk because there's something interesting there. Is there a way to recreate that in the virtual environment?
I do think this is where hybrid actually has an advantage. If the manager of the team or the team and the manager come in, rather than just sit and be on headphones and be in meetings all day, to make sure that you connect with other teams and make sure that you're in the office when other teams are in the office, I think is definitely one of the advantages of this. There's some things you just cannot replicate. You can't replicate drinks in the pub, a glass of wine, but what remote work companies do is they do make sure that people travel somewhere together, or different teams interact. And I don't think you can get it exactly right, and I don't think you should try, but I do think you can do a lot more.
Yes. And I've read that there's been some work done in research that actually, when you are intentional about those things, something that you advocate for, that intentionality in building social capital, virtual or hybrid can be more effective than the traditional way of working, because you relied on serendipity, and sometimes it's wonderful and surprising in really incredible ways, but often things just don't happen if you are not intentional. So if you bring that intentionality into your hybrid setting, what I understand from the research that I've read is that you actually have higher chances of building better social capital within your organization.
Yeah, I do believe that. I think as soon as you become deliberate or intentional about it, there are people who say, if you put it out there in the universe, it comes back to you. I think there is that same element of being intentional and then going and finding it. It will come back. I don't know to what extent you can really have that, I bumped into you in the hallway, let's talk quickly effect. There are some tools that are trying to solve this, but I do think you can build a very strong social capital index for your team and organization and not need almost that serendipitous side of it.
I love this tool and this idea of asking your team these questions and taking this intentional approach. And I'm also curious, since we're speaking about social connections, what do you see and what practices could you share with us in order to build even more meaningful human connections? I think most of our listeners will know and be familiar with Gallup's research that says that people who have a friend at work are more likely to stay with the organization. They're definitely more engaged and more productive. But I think what's even more important from a human point of view is that it also helps mental and even physical well-being of individuals to have a friend at work. And I had a very interesting experience actually this past weekend when I was invited to a Eurovision party. For our listeners in Australia or America, Australia actually will know because they participate now, but other continents, they have no idea what Eurovision is. It's a song show, basically song competition in Europe, which is very unique. And so we had this party where basically we were watching the finals, and I was introduced by one of my team members there. And, I looked around and I realized that probably 90% of the people who were invited to that party were people that he and his partner knew from work. And so I asked, are all of these people, your friends from work? And they were like, actually, yeah, probably 90%. And I thought, wow, this is something that people who work in remote first organizations probably don't have. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts around, how do you address that? And how do you address, because you did talk about well-being and the impact remote and hybrid might have on people's well-being. What are your thoughts on that?
One of the things that I've seen remote work companies encourage is for their people to go out into the community and to actually give back into the community, into their local community. They will sponsor it. They will support it in ways. So that's one of the things I've seen. I think there's a difficult scenario where maybe people were at work and were spending time in social gatherings at work because they didn't want to be at home with the people they were at home with. I'm not sure I can solve. I'm not sure we can solve for that. If I think about the different remote work companies I've studied, a lot of them go out of their way to connect up where they can. So Hotjar have they've got a work together bonus where I think it's 2,000 euros a year, where you can go and spend time working with team members or different team members and build those connections and build those relationships, where they literally a team that I heard of, 8 of them, 7 teams went to Barcelona, rented an Airbnb, worked together, and then partied together, ate together, and that's how they build that up. And that's how they build their internal connections. And it's almost more meaningful when you do it like that. So I think there are different tools and different ways to do this. There's not a quick fix there.
Yeah, absolutely not. I interviewed Professor Dunbar on this show as well. And it was really interesting because he talks about, he researches how people form these social bonds. And he says, well, one of the really important factors is, how much time we spend together physically in the same space doing things together. And so I think it's a really good solve to have your people spend a large chunk of time together, where probably the intensity of being together during that 1 week where people, as you say, they live together, they work together, they party together, is way higher than it would be if they were working in the office. And I've heard a lot of organizations go this route to strengthen these relationships. So we talked about the 3 important elements to take into consideration, collaboration being the final one. And I'm curious whether you have any thoughts to share with us around what are the key success factors that we need to be taking into consideration to do hybrid well? Because hybrid, I think at this stage, is quite a popular solution for many organizations, but I think very, very few organizations got it right.
I would agree with that. There is a culture decoupling happening. There used to be one organizational culture, and maybe there were a few teams where the culture didn't overlap. They were renegades or mavericks, but generally, because everybody was in the same building or the same buildings, the culture was consistent. But now we've got this decoupling happening where you've got an organizational culture which is losing its strength and its ability to guide. And you have the managers who now are driving more of the learning about culture that their team have. And those managers have not been trained about the organizational culture. They're not trained to develop culture. They don't know how to synchronize the team culture with the organizational culture. And I think this is a very important thing to think about, because if you're a big organization and you have, 1,000, 2,000 managers around the world, you can have 2,000 subcultures, radically different and varied from the organizational culture you want.
Yeah, totally. And it's not obviously an entirely bad thing, right? Because clearly you cannot have the exact same culture in every department, in every team, in every group. And probably you don't want to, frankly, because probably you want a slightly different microculture in your marketing department than the microculture that you have in your accounting department. I would hope that you'd want a slightly different culture. But what I'm hearing is what's really important is to identify what are these core elements of your culture that you want to be consistent across the organization.
The way I think about it is this sort of cultural umbrella where there are your values, your mission, your vision, your behaviors that are, this is what's set in stone. You can interpret them somewhat in your team based on your leadership style, based on communication, based on various things, but they still are this is what we stand for. This is how we do things around here. You're exactly right. There should be, subcultures form naturally and they should form. You can't stop them from forming. But if they form under the umbrella of the culture you want to drive forward, that's where you're in a solid position.
Yeah. Love that. I have one final question on the topic of hybrid culture, and then I think we'll be shifting gears and moving towards the rapid fire questions. I know that a lot of our listeners are big fans of using metrics and trying to quantify what they're doing around cultivating a better workplace. And I know that you've been doing a lot of work in the space of hybrid work. So, what are, if any, ways of measuring your hybrid work culture and how healthy it is? Are there any key metrics or indicators that we should be paying attention to?
I think the standard surveys, pulse surveys, et cetera, should still be run, of course. What I'm seeing is specific questions around hybrid and ways of working, and questions around the hybrid manager coming to the fore now. The manager is at the spearhead of this, and there's a realization that, well, we know people don't leave companies, they leave managers, they leave. So this is, and the managers now are a little bit further away. We've designed the program to allow you to build a consistent hybrid culture. So you would be able to deliver consistency, you would be able to measure based on that consistency. The challenge is right now, if you have 500 managers in your organization, there's no consistency with how they are delivering and executing hybrid work in their team. And that means that it's quite hard to manage and quite hard to measure from the senior level down.
You want to be able to achieve that consistency in order to be able to measure it, but also, of course, to enable collaboration and set your teams up for success. Okay, let's shift gears for a moment, Bret. We have a tradition here. I ask 5 questions to my guests at the end of the show in rapid succession. The idea is that you'll try to answer these 5 questions in under 2 minutes. In our community, the CultureBrained, we're on a mission to make work, as we say, synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. And I'm curious, what is your number one tip to bring more belonging, particularly into the hybrid workplace?
More consistent, more regular, more one-to-one meetings that the manager doesn't run. The manager is not responsible for running.
Interesting. What is the sign, or perhaps signs in plural, that a company culture, a company hybrid culture perhaps, needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
They all do. Ultimately, you can describe hybrid culture in 4 ways: strong, weak, functional, or dysfunctional. And so if strong is clear values, mission, and vision, defined. Functional means processes, documentation, all of these functional elements are in place. That's how I look at it. And most organizations right now are in the strongish but dysfunctional area.
Are there any companies that you admire for their culture? And if yes, why?
Yeah, I'm super impressed with Microsoft. I bet you didn't think I was going to say that. They have done a really good job of adapting and really taking a leadership position. I love the GitLab culture. So those 2 are my standouts at the moment.
Are there any books on culture, leadership, perhaps even philosophy that you believe people who are really committed to creating a thriving workplace should read?
Anything by Edgar Schein. It's not about hybrid, but it's all about culture.
Mm-hmm. And finally, what is one thing that our listeners could do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Get all team managers to create a team agreement with their teams.
Awesome. Bret, thank you so much for this conversation. This is the plug zone now. So if you have anything that you would like to share with our listeners, I know that you have this wonderful new program that helps managers be effective in this new kind of workplace called hybrid. Where can people find it, and where else should they go if they want to learn more about you and your work?
So the company is CultureGene.ai, which is culturegene.ai. There is a new website on the way, so please, if it does feel a little bit dated, I apologize. You could find out more about the hybrid management training program. I love to talk about culture, and again, if it was up to me, we'd be talking about culture twice a week at least, you and I.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody wants to reach out and just say, Bret, take me through any of those elements you want, just reach out to me, Bret at CultureGene.ai. I'd be happy to spend some time discussing what we found in the research we've done and what we've developed in the program.
Wonderful. And we're going to put all these links in the show notes as well for our listeners, and you'll get the main points from this conversation in the show notes as well. So check them out on our website. Bret, thank you again for being here. Thank you for supporting the CultureBrained community as well, because you are going to be our guest and do a fireside chat with our members. We're really looking forward to that.
As am I. Again, great to be on your podcast a second time. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Anis Enlabarawi, production manager.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for joining Bret and me for this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found this conversation interesting or inspiring or valuable, and chances are that you did since you are still listening here, you'll enjoy listening to the previous conversation I had with Bret on building a remote culture. There's a link in the show notes. And if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and follow the Culture Lab podcast in your favorite listening app. And please do me a personal favor, a few-second favor, and share it, maybe on social or by text or by email, even just with one person. Just copy the link from the app you are using and tell your friends who want to find new, better ways of cultivating a great company culture. Tell them to listen and then perhaps chat about it, chat about what you've both discovered. Because when shows like this one become conversations and conversations become action, that's how we transform the workplace together. And if you want to dive even deeper into the topics and find like-minded peers who are in charge of a culture shaping initiative in the organization, you might consider joining the CultureBrained community. It's a one-of-a-kind culture accelerator program and a global community of peers that is shaping the future of work. You can learn more at tinyurl.com/CultureBrained, and you'll find this link in the show notes as well. Thanks again for tuning in. If you want to get free resources on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: agabayer.com/resources. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, please do it now. That's the best way you can support our work. And finally, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on the platform that you listen to. thank you. And you are amazing for listening to this point. Not many people do.